Did a very good job. Very, very, very thorough. Now, I'm Richard Zuckerman. When I was assigned to the Organized Crime Strike Force in Detroit, the third case I was assigned to was a tax prosecution of Anthony Giacalone for income tax evasion. And
the case against Tony Jack centered around his inability to account for all the money he and his wife spent to support their lavish lifestyle.
It's quite clear that he wanted and lived a polished, sophisticated existence. He's not one of the guys that you would see, you know, like in some movie.
His defense centered around the assertion that his father, a fruit peddler in Eastern Market in the early part of the century, had left Tony, as the eldest son, an inheritance of $300,000 upon his death, all saved up during his years of selling apples and grapes for pennies and nickels. Needless to say, it didn't work.
I'm along with Mike Carone here and Bill Randall, two former FBI agents that worked the OC unit in Detroit from the late 70s all the way up until just a couple years ago into the new millennium.
Giacalone's primarily being the street bosses, as you mentioned, were of particular interest to us because they were the ones that seemed to be always doing something day to day.
The trial went 7 months, 5 days a week. It was very long, was designed around the same type of prosecution that got Al Capone. It was probably a larger, longer case than the Capone case.
Tony Giacalone was convicted of income tax evasion in 1976, though he didn't enter federal prison until '79. In a separate case, the state of Michigan convicted Giacalone of extortion. His 12-year state sentence to be served concurrently with his 10-year federal sentence.
We introduced evidence that he went to a prominent Jewish businessman in the area of Flint and told him that he needed an insurance policy because a contract had been put out on his life and he would need to come up with a $25,000 premium to avoid having something unfortunate happen. In fact, the guy did pay.
Giacalone's relatively long sentences showed just how anxious the government was to get Tony Jack off the streets for as long as they could.
His sentence was very significant in terms of what people were getting in those days for tax evasion.
As the 1970s passed by, both Billy Goots and Mario Fascione broke their ties with the mob. Mario Fascione joined the Mormon Church and told his mafia benefactor that he was quitting the business.
When I sat down in front of him, and it was over at a warehouse over on I-94 in Trumbull there, and when I walked in, there was like maybe, I don't know, 10 guys, and my uncle was standing in the back with a baseball bat. Boy, he wanted to nail me so bad. My uncle was a tough individual. He was a no conscience kind of a guy, and then they just start ripping on me something horrible. I just said, you know, I spat the shtazi to be quiet. Let me tell you. So I just told him what I did, and I told him that I just bore my testimony to him, telling him that whatever you guys got to do it, because I know what I'm doing is right. He looked at me and he got a smile and he leaned forward and took his finger and he pointed at me and he said, "You do what these people want you to do." He said, "I got nothing ever to worry about." He says, "You don't." He says, "You, your dad, your family going to evaporate." He said, "Get the heck out of here."
Billy Goots drifted away from Sam Finazzo, but continued managing boxers, eventually guiding Lindell Holmes to the IBF super middleweight belt in 1990.
Once that gym went under, then there was really no connection with Sam, you know, and I just went my way and he went his way. But I'd see him periodically, you know, parties, dinners, and anytime my kids had anything going, him and Pearl were invited.
Just after Tony Jack's conviction, two more high-ranking members of the family were indicted and convicted for extortion in a case involving a Wisconsin company that made cheese for pizza parlors.
When I first came to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was assigned to the Controlled Substance Unit. Then after I'd been there about 4 or 5 months, they came down and asked if anybody was interested in working on a special case.
Jimmy Quazzarano, suspected key member of the Detroit heroin pipeline, and Bazzi Vitale helped the cheese company collect debts from mafia-controlled pizza parlors on the East Coast.
They went back and asked Quasarano and Vitale to assist again, and they said, well, this time it's going to cost you some money.
Jimmy Q and Bozzie moved in for the kill, effectively taking over the company and lining their own pockets with company money.
And you're highly in debt to these guys. You can't pay your debt up. If you're not paying, they're going to find a way to get into your business. It's going to be coming in the front door, going out the back door, and you can't pay. And next thing you know, you're bankrupt.
Around this time, the Detroit LCN was gaining control of the Frontier Casino in Las Vegas, and the FBI began an investigation into the Detroit Combination's activities in the deserts of Nevada.
In addition to the traditional rackets that are the lifeblood of any mafia family, like sports gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, the Detroit Mafia had its hook in an even bigger cash cow, Las Vegas. In the early 1960s, Detroit fronted the money for the Frontier Hotel and Casino. Joe Zarelli appointed as point men on the Las Vegas rackets his son, Anthony Tony Z. Zarelli, and future consigliere, Michael Big Mike Polizzi.
The Frontier case was one of the first hidden ownership cases involving a Las Vegas casino, the Frontier Hotel.
Tony Zarelli and Mike Polizzi ended up getting convicted of skimming money from the casino and ended up having to do jail time. Joe Zarelli at this point had to make a decision. Tony Zarelli, his son, had been chosen to be his heir apparent, the next boss of the Detroit Mafia family. But his imprisonment and his escapades in Las Vegas raised a red flag with his father. Joe Zarelli was worried that maybe Tony Zarelli wasn't the best man to lead the family. So Zarelli at this point made a very controversial decision. He demoted Tony Zarelli while he was serving his time on the Frontier bus and promoted his nephew, Blackjack Tocco, Giacomo Tocco.
In 1976, FBI agent William Kane testified in front of the Nevada Gaming Commission concerning the licensing of one James Tamer to work at the Aladdin Casino in Las Vegas. He testified that he had observed multiple meetings between Charles Goldfarb, Mr. Tamer, and Vito Giacalone at the Chuck Joseph's Place for Steak restaurant in Detroit. At these meetings, the Detroit Mafia's control and influence at the Aladdin Casino was discussed, with Vito Giacalone mentioning the possible loss of money from the Teamsters Pension Fund if certain problems weren't solved.
We're standing in front of Goldfarb Surety Bonds. Goldfarb Bonds is owned by Charles Goldfarb, on the streets known as Chucky G. Chucky Goldfarb, in addition to being a frontman for the Detroit mob's ventures into Las Vegas for Aladdin, was also known as a kind of a bail bondsman to the stars of the street of Detroit. In the 1970s, he kind of made a name for himself by going to New York City and bailing out legendary New York crime kingpin Leroy Hollywood Nicky Barnes. And more recently, kind of made a name for himself in the local press by bailing out former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick.
On March 13, 1979, the Aladdin Hotel Corporation and 4 individuals, James Tamer, Edward Monazim, Charles Goldfarb, and James Abraham, were convicted of allowing hidden interests to exert control over the casino.
In 1976, an East Coast race-fixing team with mob connections descended upon Detroit. They set up shop here at Derby's. This race-fixing team was led by a legendary race fixer across the country by the name of Anthony Tony the Fixer Chula. Chula was taught in the ways of the underworld by legendary mobster James Whitey Bulger, who led the Boston's Irish Mafia for much of the 20th century.
Even with Tony Jack and capos like Jimmy Q going on trial, the action didn't stop. In 1976, the family set up another money-making caper at their old stomping grounds, the Hazel Park Racetrack.
Chula and his race-fixing team, which consisted of about 5 other guys, made an arrangement to begin fixing races here in Detroit and giving the Detroit Mafia a piece of the action. Because of Chula's connections to the Detroit Mafia, he gained access to stables, jockeys, and so forth, which gave him the ability to manipulate race outcomes. Chula's operation was finally taken down in 1978 by the FBI task force. Under intense interrogation by FBI authorities, Chula finally broke. And in 1978, late 1978, Chula turned FBI informant and began informing on his former cohorts in the Mafia.
Freddie the Pope Salem was a fixture on the Detroit gambling circuit from the 1960s into the new millennium. A world-class pool player in a game played mostly by serious gamblers called One Pocket, Salem wasn't Italian, but he had the charisma and talents to rise to a position of unquestioned power and authority in the Detroit La Cosa Nostra clan.
We're here on Capitol Street in Oak Park, in front of the former site of the Capitol Street Social Club. headquarters of Detroit Mafia gambling lieutenant Freddie the Saint Salem through most of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Salem was unique on the streets of Detroit for several reasons, but first off, for the fact that he was Syrian. There are very few syndicates that would allow a non-made member or a non-Italian to reach the heights that Salem reached. He had a crew of up to about 10 people that ran different gambling rackets for them, and Salem status on the streets of Detroit actually equaled, if not exceeded, a lot of made members of the Detroit Mafia.
In Detroit, membership in the organized crime family was limited to those of Sicilian background. People like Alan Hilf and Freddie Salem were always believed by the government and were indicted on numerous occasions for their involvement. They had a lot of power because they generated a lot of income.
Freddie Salem, I like Freddie. He was a gentleman. He was, I think everybody thought that of him. I had to arrest him one time. He followed me downtown, parked the car, he got in my car, and then we took him inside, processed him.
One good thing about our Detroit La Cosa Nostra family, they will utilize everybody and anybody that befriends them, that they trust, but of course, they, again, trust them only to a degree.
The FBI was finally able to infiltrate one of Salem's dice games located on Elmira Street in northeast Detroit with an undercover agent.
And you were known, you knew that Salem was, even though not a made member, Freddie Salem, known as the Freddie the Saint, Four Horse Freddie, Freddie the Pope, whatnot, was probably the premier non-Italian mob associate and was reporting directly to Tony Giacalone and his brother.
Absolutely.
The clientele of the games ranged widely, but they all had one thing in common. They liked to spend money.
You'd have a bunch of topless dancers that would come in there, after hours drinking, use of drugs. Pretty high stakes craps games going on. I mean, $15,000, $20,000 pots would not be uncommon.
When the Elmira Street game was raided in the late 70s, dozens of arrests were made, along with numerous guns and tens of thousands in cash being seized from the little wood frame house that served as Salem's crown jewel at the time. October 1977. Joe Zerilli dies after 40 years of being the boss of the Detroit La Cosa Nostra. Zerilli had been the longest-serving Don in the country and had for many years probably served as the consigliere of the National Mafia Commission itself, mediating disputes between the New York Dons and advising other mob bosses around the country. Zerilli had lived a low-key life, rarely leaving his various estates in the Detroit area, never being recorded by the government, and avoiding any serious legal problems. By the time of his death, Joe Uno had built the Detroit family into an efficient and unbreakable money-making machine. But his legacy had failed in one key area, his son Tony.
We're standing here at the 8.5 and Ryan in front of the former corporate headquarters of Bellamia Pasta and Sauce and the Spaghetti Palace, two infamous Detroit Mafia front businesses that were owned by Detroit underboss Tony Zerilli. Now, Zerilli would spend a lot of afternoons between the mid-1960s all the way up until the 1980s at his digs here at the corporate headquarters of Bellamia Pasta and Spaghetti Palace.
In the early 70s, Tony Z, as Zerilli was called on the street, was tapped to be the next boss and replace his father when he died.
Tony Zerilli and Jack Tocco were really the two mob princes coming up in the 1940s and 50s, and were really looked at as the future of the family by their fathers, Black Bill Tocco and Joe Zerilli, who were the founding fathers of the family, obviously. Zerilli and Tocco, the younger Zerilli and Tocco, kind of started off on the same trajectory, parallel to each other, with Tony Zerilli kind of being at the forefront and Jack being at the back. But their careers in the underworld around here kind of diverged and went in two different paths as the years went on.
Zerilli had been demoted by his father after numerous blunders that led to the Detroit family being kicked out of Las Vegas. His cousin Jack Tocco was now poised to become the new boss. The top capos and consigliere of the combination paid respects to the new Don, Jack Tocco, all except one. Tony Zerilli was conspicuously absent from the proceedings.
Standing here with Keith Corbett, more than 20 years a member of the U.S. Prosecutor's Office and one of the primary nemesis of the Detroit Mafia here in Detroit.
I noticed significant differences between the families.